A famous liberal journalist mocks Keanu Reeves on live television, expecting an easy win. What happens next leaves the entire studio silent and changes everything they thought they knew about him. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. In a world addicted to noise, Keanu Reeves had always chosen silence, not the kind that isolates or retreats, but the kind that listens, that observes, that acts when it matters most. Over the years, his quiet strength had become something of a legend. While others chased headlines and social media moments, Keanu remained grounded, working behind the scenes to support children's hospitals, fund cancer research, and help the homeless. He was a man who believed in dignity without announcement, compassion without applause. And yet, there was a price for such humility. In an age where volume often replaced value, Keanu was labeled by some as out of touch, too private, or even irrelevant. None of that mattered to him. His focus had never been on keeping up appearances. He stayed true to himself, letting his work and actions speak louder than any interview ever could. But everything changed the day an invitation arrived. Not from a film studio or a charity gala, but from one of the most watched late-night talk shows in America, The Spotlight, hosted by Fiona Carrington. Fiona Carrington was a force. Sharp, unapologetic, and fearless, she was known for her biting wit and cutting questions. Her interviews had made headlines for years, often dismantling celebrities and politicians in real time with her sarcastic charm and quick comebacks. Her audience adored her for it. She was the queen of late-night commentary, unafraid to take down anyone who didn't share her modern views or progressive ideals. And now Fiona wanted Keanu Reeves on her show. The formal invitation was direct: a primetime interview, a live audience, a conversation about his career, his legacy, and his place in today's world. On paper, it sounded respectful, but everyone on Keanu's team knew better. They had seen Fiona's interviews before. She invited guests not to listen but to challenge. She was known to corner her subjects, twist their words, and provoke reactions that made for viral soundbites. She had a knack for finding weak spots and pressing hard. For Fiona was a perfect target. An old-school movie star known for stoic action heroes and quiet off-screen life. She saw him as a relic of the past. Her team was already crafting questions designed to poke fun at his values, his age, and his calm, introspective nature. When the invitation came, Keanu's assistant, Michael, brought it straight to him. They were at Keanu's home in the Hollywood Hills, sitting on the back patio that overlooked the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. Keanu was pouring tea into 2 small cups when Michael handed him the letter. "You don't have to do this," Michael said carefully, watching Keanu's face. "Fiona Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory." Keanu studied the letter for a moment before setting it down on the table. He picked up his tea, took a slow sip, and looked out at the horizon. "I know," he said quietly. Michael hesitated, unsure if Keanu's tone meant he was considering it or dismissing it altogether. "She's going to come after you," he said finally. "Your movies, your choices, maybe even your personal life. She's ruthless." Keanu smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "People can say what they want. It doesn't change the truth." There was a long pause. The city lights were beginning to glow in the distance. "You're sure?" Michael asked, not because he doubted Keanu's decision, but because he wanted him to be certain. Keanu nodded. "It's not about winning. It's about showing up." Michael exhaled, knowing the decision had been made. In the days that followed, Fiona's team prepared for what they saw as an easy win. They pored over Keanu's interviews, his film roles, and his public appearances. They crafted questions designed to expose him as old-fashioned, too quiet, too out of step with the times. Fiona herself was excited. She saw this interview as an opportunity to shine a light on outdated ideals and give her audience the cutting commentary they had come to expect. Meanwhile, Keanu carried on as usual. He went for morning rides on his motorcycle along the coast. He volunteered at a children's hospital, quietly bringing books and toys to young patients. He had dinner with old friends. There was no strategy meeting, no rehearsed answers. He didn't prepare zingers or comebacks. He didn't need to. For Keanu, this wasn't a battle. It was a conversation. When the night of the interview finally arrived, Keanu arrived at the studio alone, dressed in a simple black suit and open-collar shirt. No entourage, no flashing cameras, just him. He walked calmly through the backstage corridors, nodding politely to the staff, some of whom looked at him with curiosity, others with quiet respect. Michael was waiting in the green room, holding a bottle of water. "Last chance to back out," he said, half joking. Keanu took the water, gave a small smile, and shook his head. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As he sat quietly, waiting for his cue, the muffled sound of the audience filtered in from the studio. He could hear them laughing at Fiona's opening monologue, already filled with sharp jokes at his expense. Michael glanced at him nervously, but Keanu just closed his eyes for a moment, took a slow breath, and waited. He wasn't there to defend his legacy. He wasn't there to fight back. He was there to be himself. And sometimes, that's more powerful than anything you could ever say. The bright lights of the studio shimmered like stars caught inside a glass box. The crowd murmured with anticipation, the energy in the air electric, buzzing with expectation. This was Fiona Carrington's house, her territory, a place where wit cut like a knife and few guests left without feeling the sting. Fiona stood backstage for a moment, adjusting the cuffs of her tailored suit. She exhaled slowly and stepped toward the wings of the stage, her team trailing close behind. Veronica, her head writer, gave her a reassuring nod as they walked. "They're ready for you," Veronica said. "They want fireworks." Fiona smiled, her expression sharpened by confidence. "They'll get them." Inside the control room, producers ran final checks. Teleprompters glowed with carefully crafted lines. Every joke had been fine-tuned, every barb carefully placed. They were ready. Tonight's target was Keanu Reeves. To Fiona's team, it seemed almost unfair. He was too quiet, too polite, a relic of an older Hollywood that didn't fit with the brash new world they occupied. To them, Keanu was stuck in a time when stoic silence and chivalrous manners were enough. Fiona believed her audience wanted more. They wanted a challenge. They wanted her to push him, to expose the old-fashioned ideals that she saw as outdated. She was ready to oblige. In the days leading up to the show, Fiona had worked tirelessly on her material. Clips of Keanu's old action films played on a loop as she scribbled notes in the margins of her outline. She chuckled to herself at the contrast between his silent on-screen heroes and the world they now lived in, one that demanded noise, opinions, and declarations at every turn. Her writers crafted questions that would sting. They focused on his age, his refusal to engage in public debates, and his reputation for staying silent on political issues. They prepared segments designed to ridicule his charity work as mere PR. To them, Keanu was an easy mark. Fiona was sure of it. The audience had been carefully selected, regular viewers of the show, most of them progressive thinkers, many of them skeptical of Keanu's perceived lack of engagement in today's conversations about change. Fiona counted on their energy. She knew they would laugh on cue, cheer when she landed a punchline, and side with her without hesitation. Backstage, Keanu sat quietly in the green room. He listened to the muffled sounds of the studio crowd, their laughter rising and falling as Fiona's monologue played out. Michael, his assistant, sat nearby, watching the monitor nervously. Fiona was already cracking jokes at Keanu's expense. "Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "A man so quiet you'd think he was still stuck in character from his last movie." The audience roared. "They say still waters run deep, but sometimes they're just still, because there's nothing there." Another wave of laughter. Michael glanced over at Keanu. He found him as he always was, calm, composed. unmoved. "She's laying it on thick," Michael said quietly. Keanu's gaze remained steady on the monitor. "It's her job," he replied, his tone neutral. "Let her do it." Michael shook his head. "You don't have to go out there." Keanu looked at him, his eyes kind. "Yes, I do." On stage, Fiona kept going. She joked about Keanu's age, calling him the last surviving action figure, and poked fun at his minimalist lifestyle, suggesting he was either a monk or just really cheap. The crowd ate it up. Her timing was impeccable, her delivery razor sharp. And then came the introduction. Fiona stood center stage, her smile wide as applause swelled around her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "you know him from the movies where he doesn't say much, and probably from that one time he looked sad on a bench. Please welcome the man, the myth, the mystery, Keanu Reeves." The applause was mixed, some clapping out of politeness, others booing, though lightly, but most were watching with curiosity, waiting to see how this man would react. Keanu walked onto the stage with quiet confidence, no swagger, no bravado, just steady steps, his hands relaxed at his sides. He wore a simple black suit, understated and elegant, his long hair tucked neatly behind his ears. There was no forced smile on his face, just a calm presence that seemed to slow the energy in the room. He extended his hand toward Fiona. She shook it, but there was a gleam in her eye, as if she were holding back another joke. Keanu simply nodded and took his seat. As they settled into their chairs, the contrast between them was stark. Fiona leaned forward, brimming with energy, ready to pounce. Keanu leaned back, his posture open, his expression unreadable. He looked completely at ease. That, in itself, unsettled her just a little. "Welcome to the show, Keanu," Fiona began, her voice friendly but edged with mockery. "I wasn't sure you'd accept. You're a hard man to pin down." "Thank you for having me," Keanu said, his voice calm and warm. "It's good to be here." The audience chuckled. Fiona smiled tightly. "Well, we have a lot to talk about. 6 decades in Hollywood, and still going. That's impressive." Keanu nodded, not biting at the bait. "I'm grateful I still get to do what I love." Fiona didn't miss a beat. "But times change, don't they? Hollywood's not what it was, and let's be honest, neither are the values you stood for in your early films. The strong, silent type doesn't really fit today's world, does it?" A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. Fiona leaned forward slightly, waiting. Keanu tilted his head as if considering her words carefully. "The world changes," he said simply, "but some things are worth holding on to." The crowd grew quieter than expected. Fiona raised an eyebrow, but moved on. "What about your silence on politics?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "Some would say staying quiet is the same as being complicit." Keanu met her gaze evenly. "I believe in listening more than speaking, especially when the world's already full of noise." The audience shifted in their seats, unsure how to react. Some clapped softly, others murmured. Fiona tried another angle. "But don't you think people look up to you? Don't they deserve to know where you stand?" Keanu's answer was steady. "I stand for kindness. I stand for respect. I think people know that." Fiona opened her mouth to push harder, but for a brief second, something in Keanu's calm, quiet confidence made her hesitate. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't flustered. He was centered. The problem, as Fiona was quickly realizing, wasn't that Keanu Reeves was easy to mock. It was that he wouldn't play the game. And without the game, the crowd wasn't reacting the way she expected. The stage was set, but the night wasn't going the way anyone thought it would. And this was just the beginning. The studio lights burned brighter as the show returned from its first commercial break. Fiona Carrington leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming lightly against her desk. Across from her, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the crowd. He simply waited, his steady presence at odds with the tense energy in the room. Fiona glanced at the audience, who were still chuckling softly from her earlier jokes. She smiled. This was her territory, and she wasn't about to lose control of it. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Keanu. "Keanu Reeves," she began, her tone light but laced with sarcasm. "Proof you don't need to say much to stay relevant." There was scattered laughter from the crowd, a few claps. Fiona basked in it for a moment. Keanu's response was simple. He smiled faintly, then said, "Sometimes silence speaks the loudest." The room stilled for a fraction of a second. Fiona felt it, even if the audience didn't. Something in the weight of his words cut through the noise. But she wasn't done. "Well, sure," she replied, her voice sharp. "But silence can also mean you don't have anything to say." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Or it means you're listening." The audience murmured. Some nodded. Others remained silent, unsure how to react. Fiona pressed on. "Let's talk about your career," she said, flipping through her notes with deliberate flair. "You've built a legacy on playing strong, silent types. The lone hero, the stoic protector. But the world's changed, Keanu. People are questioning those old-school ideals. Don't you think it's time to move on from that outdated image of masculinity?" Her words hung in the air, charged and provocative. A few members of the audience clapped, sensing where she was heading. Keanu didn't rush his answer. He took a breath, then said, "Those characters were about courage, about resilience, about protecting what matters most. They weren't about shutting people out. They were about standing up when no one else would." Fiona nodded slowly, as if considering his words, before striking again. "But courage and resilience can take different forms today, can't they? Do you think those old characters would hold up in this world?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "I think values like integrity, loyalty, and compassion never go out of style. They're not old, they're timeless." The response wasn't flashy. It wasn't defensive, but it landed. The audience grew quieter, leaning in just a little. Fiona changed tactics. "Let's talk about your off-screen persona," she said. "You've built a reputation for being generous, almost too generous, donating millions, giving away parts of your salary, supporting charities. Some people say it's all an image, a way to avoid controversy by playing the nice guy." The crowd stirred. This was familiar ground for Fiona's viewers, exposing contradictions, pulling back the curtain. Keanu nodded slowly. "Kindness isn't a strategy," he said. "It's a choice. Every day." The simplicity of his answer caught Fiona off guard for a split second. She recovered quickly. "But you have to admit," she pushed, "in an industry where everyone's trying to protect their brand, being the nice guy has worked pretty well for you." Keanu gave a small smile, almost amused. "I don't think about my brand. I think about whether I've made someone's day better, whether I've helped where I could. That's enough for me." The audience was silent now, not hostile, not even skeptical, just listening. Fiona's team in the control room exchanged glances. This wasn't the reaction they had planned for. The energy was shifting, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Fiona wasn't ready to give up. "So you never get angry?" she asked. "Never want to fight back when people mock you, call you irrelevant?" Keanu's expression softened. "Anger's easy," he said, "but it doesn't get you very far. Listening does." Fiona leaned back slightly. "That's a nice philosophy. But isn't there a time to speak up, to take a stand?" "I am," Keanu replied. "Right now." The words were quiet, but they hit harder than any shouted declaration. For a moment, Fiona didn't respond. She glanced at the audience. They were with him, not because he had overpowered her, but because he hadn't tried to. She cleared her throat, flipping her notes again. "Let's talk about age," she said, grasping at the next topic. "You're almost 60. Hollywood isn't always kind to actors past a certain point. Do you ever feel like your time has passed?" Keanu smiled gently. "I think time is a gift. Every day I get to do what I love is a blessing, And if there's more to come, I'll be grateful for that too. The crowd, previously quick to laugh at Fiona's jabs, was now subdued, reflective. Some even clapped quietly. Fiona's voice softened slightly. But you've lost roles because you refuse to play the Hollywood game. You've turned down projects, walked away from big paychecks. Don't you ever wonder if it was worth it? Keanu's eyes were steady. What you keep matters more than what you gain. I kept my integrity. That's enough. The room was silent again. Fiona shifted in her seat. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. She had expected a defensive Keanu, maybe even a flustered one. But he was calm, unshakable. And his answers were not just deflections, they were truths that resonated. She tried one last angle. What do you say to people who think you're stuck in the past? She asked. That the world has moved on and you haven't. Keanu took a moment before answering. I think moving forward doesn't mean leaving behind what's good. It means carrying it with you and sharing it. There was a quiet power in his words. The audience was no longer waiting for a witty comeback. They were waiting for wisdom, and Keanu was giving it to them. Fiona glanced at her producers through the studio glass. They were signaling her to wrap the segment. But she hesitated. She looked back at Keanu. You've talked about listening, she said. You've talked about kindness. But how do you deal with the fact that not everyone is kind? That some people will never listen? Keanu's voice was gentle. You treat them with respect anyway, because how you act isn't about them. It's about you. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Fiona sat back in her chair, watching him. This wasn't a man clinging to old ideas. This was someone who had quietly carved out a space in a noisy world and invited people to step into it. The segment ended soon after, but the energy in the room had changed completely. Fiona knew it. So did her audience. Keanu Reeves hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He hadn't played the game. And somehow, he had won. The studio air felt heavier now. Not tense in the way Fiona Carrington had expected, but dense with something she hadn't anticipated. Reflection. Keanu Reeves had answered every challenge she threw his way with a quiet strength that didn't seek to dominate, only to stand firm. And that unsettled her more than if he had met her sarcasm with anger. She crossed her legs, leaning forward. Her voice softened just enough to conceal the sharpness of her next question. Keanu, she said, resting her hands on the desk between them. Don't you think your silence makes you irrelevant in a world full of noise? The crowd gave a light chuckle, but it faded quickly, as if even they were unsure how to feel. Keanu let the words hang there for a moment. Then he breathed in, slow and steady, and offered a faint, knowing smile. The world, Keanu began, his voice even, doesn't need more noise, it needs more listening. For the first time that night, Fiona felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had built her entire career on being louder, quicker, sharper. She had always believed that if you weren't the loudest voice in the room, you were irrelevant. But now, sitting across from Keanu, it was clear that his quiet presence was commanding the space in a way noise never could. She studied him for a long moment, waiting for him to elaborate. But he didn't fill the silence. He let it breathe. And in that space, something remarkable happened. The audience grew still, not waiting for a punchline, not leaning toward Fiona for a clever retort. They leaned toward Keanu, because they could sense he wasn't finished. Fiona cleared her throat. So, you believe silence is enough? Her tone had softened. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was curiosity. Keanu looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Then he spoke. I grew up without much. We didn't have a lot of money. We moved around a lot. My father left when I was young. My mother worked hard, but there were times when it felt like we were invisible. Like no one saw us, or if they did, they didn't care. He paused. Not for effect, but because the weight of memory asked for it. When I was in high school, he continued, I wanted to be an actor. I wasn't a natural. People told me I was too quiet, my voice was too soft, I was too wooden. I didn't belong. I was told I'd never make it, that I didn't have what it takes. Keanu's gaze drifted out toward the audience. They were silent now, leaning in. But I kept going, he said, not because I thought I was better than anyone, but because I loved it. I loved telling stories. I loved connecting with people, even if it was just one person who needed to hear something different. Fiona sat back slowly, her pen motionless between her fingers. Keanu's voice softened, and then, "My sister got sick." A few in the audience gasped quietly. Fiona's expression changed, the edge slipping away. "She was diagnosed with leukemia," Keanu said. "She was young, full of life. She fought hard. I spent years watching her go through pain, surgeries, treatments, and every time I walked into that hospital, I saw people who were suffering quietly, people who were often ignored." He paused again, his hands resting loosely on his lap. "That's when I learned," he continued, "that listening is sometimes the most powerful thing you can do. It doesn't fix everything, but it makes people feel seen. It gives them dignity." The audience was completely silent. A few people wiped their eyes discreetly. Fiona swallowed hard. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't sure anyone had. Keanu smiled faintly, not out of happiness, but out of gratitude. "When my sister passed," he said, "I promised myself I would honor her life by listening more, by showing respect, by being kind when no one was watching." Fiona exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. Keanu turned back toward her. "So when you ask me if silence makes me irrelevant," he said, his voice unwavering, "I think of my sister. I think of the people who are overlooked every day, and I believe they deserve to be heard." For a moment, Fiona didn't speak. Neither did the audience. The entire room had shifted from a battleground to something else entirely, something deeper. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her footing. "That's a powerful story," she said, her voice quieter than before. Keanu didn't nod or thank her for the comment. He simply let it be what it was. Fiona hesitated. Then she asked, "Do you think people listening to you now understand that? That it's not about being right, but about being present?" Keanu's gaze softened. "I think we all forget sometimes. We think we need to win the argument, be the loudest, but sometimes just being present is enough." The audience was still as statues, hanging on his words. Fiona looked down at her notes, then back up at him. They suddenly felt irrelevant. There were no clever jabs left that could land without feeling hollow. She glanced at the crowd, sensing that they had crossed some invisible threshold. They weren't waiting for her anymore. They were waiting for him. She leaned in, her tone no longer sharp. "What would you say to someone," she asked, "who feels invisible, who thinks they don't have a voice?" Keanu took a moment before answering. His reply was quiet but clear. "Your voice matters, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. The world may not always listen right away, but that doesn't mean you stop speaking." Fiona felt the truth of that settle somewhere inside her, deeper than she cared to admit. Keanu continued, "You don't have to change the world all at once. You just have to be true, to yourself and to others." A young woman in the front row wiped a tear from her cheek. A middle-aged man further back crossed his arms, his face thoughtful. Fiona sat back, taking a breath. "You've given me a lot to think about," she admitted. Keanu offered a small smile. "That's all any of us can do." For a moment, the studio felt like a different place. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was still there. But it wasn't a show anymore. It was a conversation. One that mattered. Fiona looked down again at her notes. She closed the folder quietly and set it aside. "You know," she said, "when we booked you for this interview, I thought I was going to win a debate." Keanu smiled faintly. "This isn't a debate." She nodded. "No, it's not." The audience clapped softly. Not because they were prompted to, but because they wanted to. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his posture as calm as it had been from the beginning. "Thank you for having me," he said, his voice warm. Fiona's expression softened. "Thank you for showing up." The segment was coming to an end, but the atmosphere in the studio was entirely transformed. There was no winner or loser, just a space where respect and quiet leadership had spoken louder than any argument ever could. As the applause swelled, Fiona realized something that would stay with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. Sometimes, the most powerful voice in the room is the one that chooses to listen. And Keanu Reeves had listened all along. The studio had settled into a stillness that was rare in live television. For the last hour, Fiona Carrington had thrown every question she could at Keanu Reeves, testing his patience, his principles, his silence. But he hadn't flinched. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't played to the crowd. And now, they had reached the final stretch. The cameras continued to roll as Fiona adjusted in her seat, glancing at her team behind the glass. They looked back at her with uncertain expressions, as if they were watching something unfamiliar. This wasn't the usual fiery debate, the verbal takedown they had come to expect from her interviews. It was something different. She looked back at Keanu. He sat quietly across from her, relaxed, calm. The weight of his words still hung in the air from his last story. His presence had disarmed the room. Even Fiona herself felt it, something she hadn't felt in years. But she wasn't ready to end it there, not yet. Fiona cleared her throat. She leaned forward once more, her hands clasped on the desk between them. Her voice was softer now, but there was still an edge to it. "Keanu," she began, "you've talked a lot about integrity, about staying true to yourself, about listening instead of shouting." She paused. He nodded once, encouraging her to continue. "But you've lost roles," she said. "You've turned down big movies, walked away from directors and studios because they asked you to compromise on your values. You've refused to sell yourself the way this industry expects." She drew in a breath, searching his expression. He didn't move. He didn't blink. "You've missed opportunities," she said quietly. "You've lost millions. You've been criticized for not speaking up when people wanted you to, for not playing the game." Another pause. The room was silent. "So I have to ask," Fiona said, "was it worth it? To stay quiet?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He took his time, as he always did. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, clear. "What you keep," Keanu said slowly, "defines you more than what you gain." Fiona's breath caught slightly in her throat. "I kept my integrity," Keanu continued, "and that's worth everything I've lost." There was a beat of silence, then another, and then the audience responded. But not with the usual clapping that followed a punchline, not with the laughter that usually filled Fiona's studio. This time, they applauded in a way that felt genuine, earnest, respectful. It started softly, then grew stronger. A standing ovation? No. But it didn't need to be. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who've just witnessed something honest, something rare. Fiona blinked, caught off guard. She had expected answers, maybe even confrontation. She hadn't expected this quiet conviction to resonate so deeply with the audience. And yet, it had. She let the applause roll for a moment. She glanced at the crowd. Some people were nodding. A few had tears in their eyes. Even her own staff, those who always cheered her sharpest barbs, seemed subdued. When the noise finally faded, Fiona turned back to Keanu. She rested her elbows on the desk and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I didn't expect this conversation to change me," she said honestly. "But it has." Keanu gave a faint smile. "That's all we can ask for, to change or to be open to it." Fiona sat back in her chair, staring at him for a long moment. The cameras were still rolling. But for the first time in her career, she didn't care what they captured. This wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about getting the last word. This was about understanding. She nodded slowly. "You didn't come here to win an argument," she said. "No," Keanu replied. "I came to be myself." Fiona smiled, and for once, it wasn't practiced. And that was enough. Keanu nodded. "It always is." The control room signaled to Fiona that the segment was wrapping up. She ignored them for another beat. Then she turned back to the cameras, her expression different now. Softer. "Well," she said, her voice steady but sincere, "that's all the time we have tonight. I want to thank Keanu Reeves for joining us, and for reminding us that sometimes the quietest voices have the most to say." The audience applauded again, and this time it wasn't prompted. It wasn't the product of a flashing sign or a producer waving a hand. It was real. Keanu stood slowly, offering Fiona his hand. She took it. The handshake was firm, respectful. As the cameras pulled back, Fiona turned toward the audience again. "Thank you for watching," she said. "We'll see you next time." The credits rolled, the house lights dimmed, the energy in the studio was different now, quieter, more thoughtful. Fiona sat at her desk for a moment longer as the crew began their usual post-show routine. She looked down at her notes, at the carefully crafted questions that now felt like artifacts from another time. She closed the folder and pushed it aside. Keanu was already walking toward the exit. No fanfare, no need to linger, just a quiet, graceful departure. Fiona found herself standing, calling after him. "Keanu!" He turned, his expression the same as it had been all night, calm, present. She took a step closer. "Thank you." He nodded. "Thank you for listening." And then he was gone. The audience slowly filed out of the studio, many of them quieter than when they had arrived. Some of them spoke in hushed tones about what they had heard. Others simply walked in silence. Fiona remained where she was for a few minutes longer, watching it all. She had built her reputation on debates, on tearing down ideas she thought outdated, but tonight had been different. Keanu hadn't defended himself, he hadn't tried to win, and because of that, he had. Later that night, Fiona sat in her dressing room, scrolling through early social media reactions. She saw clips of Keanu's words already circulating, people quoting his line about integrity and what you keep. But the post that caught her eye was simple. Keanu Reeves didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Fiona smiled faintly and set her phone down. Sometimes silence really did speak the loudest. And Keanu Reeves had just given her and everyone watching a masterclass in how to use it. By the time the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed quietly out of their seats, something had already shifted. It wasn't just the energy in the room or the way Fiona Carrington lingered behind her desk longer than usual. It was something deeper, something that followed everyone who witnessed the conversation that night. Within hours, clips from the interview began to surface online. The first one to catch fire was the moment Keanu Reeves, sitting across from Fiona's sharp wit and well-practiced questions, calmly said, "What you keep defines you more than what you gain." I kept my integrity. It was a simple sentence, direct, unpolished, but it struck a chord. By morning, the clip had been viewed over 5 million times. And it was only the beginning. Hashtags like Quiet Strength, Keanu Listens, and Integrity Matters trended across platforms. People who had once dismissed Keanu as out of step with modern Hollywood now praised his grace, his humility, and his refusal to be baited into confrontation. There were no fiery comebacks, no clickbaity-worthy outbursts, just calm, unwavering sincerity. And it resonated. Fiona Carrington's team watched the numbers climb in real time. Her producers, who had expected the usual viral moments driven by humor or controversy, found themselves witnessing something entirely different. This wasn't outrage driving engagement, it was respect. People weren't mocking Keanu's silence, they were celebrating it. They weren't criticizing his refusal to argue, they were admiring it. In the days that followed, think pieces emerged from every corner of the media landscape. Some hailed the interview as a refreshing reminder of what it meant to have integrity in a noisy world. Others questioned whether the entertainment industry had become too focused on spectacle and not enough on substance. But one thing was clear. Keanu Reeves had started a conversation far bigger than the one that took place on Fiona Carrington's set. And he had done it by listening. On social media, people shared their own stories. A teacher from Chicago wrote about how she played a clip from Keanu's interview for her high school students. She described how the room went silent, the teenagers hanging on every word, many of them reflecting on what it meant to stay true to oneself. A small business owner in Texas shared how Keanu's words made him rethink the way he treated his employees, not as numbers or tasks to manage, but as people who deserved dignity and respect. Even Fiona herself felt the shift. In the immediate hours after the show aired, she had sat in her office, scrolling through comments and reactions. She had expected criticism for going too easy on Keanu or praise for holding him accountable. But what she read was something different. "Fiona, thank you for letting Keanu speak," one comment read. "This was the first time I've seen a guest on your show who didn't fight back, and it made me listen," wrote another. "Tonight wasn't about politics. It was about humanity." Fiona closed her laptop late that night and sat back in her chair, the hum of the city outside her window a distant murmur. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what her next move should be. She wasn't thinking about ratings or clips that would go viral. She was thinking about the quiet man who had sat across from her and left a deeper mark than any argument ever had. The following morning, Fiona released a statement. It was brief, only a few sentences, but it felt necessary. "Last night's conversation with Keanu Reeves reminded me of the power of listening. In a world where everyone is trying to be heard, sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop and listen. Thank you, Keanu, for showing me that." The statement was shared widely. Many praised her for acknowledging the experience. Some called it a turning point in her career. And while Fiona wasn't certain where it would lead, she knew something inside her had shifted. As for Keanu, he returned to his quiet life as if nothing had happened. The morning after the interview aired, he was seen leaving his modest home on his motorcycle, heading toward the Pacific Coast Highway for a long ride. There were no press conferences, no interviews, no grand statements. He hadn't come to the show to make headlines. He hadn't come to change Fiona or her audience. He had come to be himself, and that was enough. Back at his house later that evening, Keanu sat on his porch with a cup of tea, staring out at the sunset over the ocean. Michael, his assistant, sat nearby, scrolling through his phone. "You've seen the numbers, right?" Michael asked, glancing over. Keanu smiled faintly. "I've heard." Michael shook his head in disbelief. "You broke the internet." Keanu chuckled softly. "I didn't do anything special." Michael set the phone down. "You did something no one else does. You didn't play the game." Keanu nodded. "Games aren't real, people are." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of waves crashing in the distance filling the space between them. For Keanu, this was enough. He had said what he needed to say. He had listened when he needed to listen. And in doing so, he had planted seeds that would grow long after the noise died down. In the weeks that followed, more interviews aired, more celebrities took their turns on Fiona's show, but none of them had the same effect. None of them brought the same quiet strength that Keanu had, and the world noticed. Fiona found herself changing too. She approached interviews differently. She listened more. She asked questions without loading them with sarcasm. She gave space for answers she didn't expect, and her audience responded. One night, weeks after the interview, Fiona found herself watching a rerun of Keanu's episode. She watched herself, sharp-tongued and poised, and she watched him, calm, centered, and true. She smiled to herself. Sometimes, the quietest voices did speak the loudest truths, and Keanu Reeves had reminded everyone of that. The days after the interview felt different, not just in the studio where it happened or in the social media feeds that carried it around the world, but in spaces where words rarely held so much weight. Something had shifted, and though the world kept spinning, people noticed. At first, it was the journalists. Across news networks and media outlets, conversation sparked about what had happened on Fiona Carrington's show. She was known for her sharp edge, for taking down guests who didn't fit the mold of her progressive, fast-talking style. Yet somehow, she had left her own interview humbled, changed, and people wanted to talk about it. The New York Times published a headline the next morning, a quiet conversation that roared, "Keanu Reeves on integrity in a noisy world." The Washington Post followed with, "When Silence Speaks," the interview that stopped us in our tracks. Even outlets that usually leaned into celebrity gossip ran unexpected think pieces. They didn't focus on Keanu's fashion or his aging gracefully. They focused on his words. CNBC invited media analysts to discuss it. One commentator said plainly, "We just watched a masterclass in authenticity, and it wasn't rehearsed. He didn't come to win. That's why he did." Other journalists, some of whom had built their careers on cutting questions and clever soundbites, found themselves writing about Fiona's rare moment of introspection. For the first time, they weren't applauding her sharp comebacks. They were praising her willingness to step back, listen, and admit she had changed. A respected media critic summed it up this way: "Fiona Carrington didn't lose that night, she grew. And that's something far more powerful than winning." But the ripples didn't stop there. Clips from the interview found their way into places no one expected: classrooms, leadership seminars, podcasts, even in boardrooms. At a small liberal arts college in Vermont, a professor played Keanu's clip for his media ethics class. He paused on the line, "What you keep defines you more than what you gain." He asked his students, "What does that mean to you?" For the next hour, they talked not about celebrity culture, but about their own choices, about what mattered to them when no one was watching. A Fortune 500 company in Chicago used the interview during a leadership training. The executive speaker explained, "Leadership isn't shouting over people, it's knowing when to be quiet and listen. Keanu showed us that." And they played the moment where he said, "The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more listening." Podcasts about personal growth, leadership, even spirituality dissected the conversation, not because Keanu was a Hollywood star, but because he had said something that rang true in a world overwhelmed by opinions, arguments, and endless noise. And there was Fiona. Her show changed, slowly at first, then noticeably. The next few interviews she hosted were different. The jokes were still there, the sharp wit hadn't dulled, but she asked fewer questions designed to corner people. She gave more space for answers she hadn't planned for. Her ratings didn't drop, in fact, they grew. Audiences noticed. They began tuning in not just for entertainment, but for conversations that made them think, for guests who could challenge Fiona and be challenged in return, but without losing respect. A journalist on NPR commented, "Fiona Carrington used to run one of the loudest shows on television. Now it's one of the most thoughtful. And it all started with Keanu Reeves." Fiona herself made small acknowledgments over time. She didn't talk about the transformation often, but when asked, she said quietly, "I realized I had spent so much time trying to win the argument that I stopped listening. Keanu reminded me what matters." Meanwhile, Keanu declined every interview request that followed. He turned down offers from major networks. He ignored calls from popular podcasts. He didn't need to say more. When asked, he simply said, "The work is more important than the noise." He returned to his quiet life. He rode his motorcycle along the Pacific Coast Highway. He volunteered quietly at children's hospitals in Los Angeles. He sent donations without press releases, and when people saw him on the street, they often thanked him. He always nodded, offered a quiet smile, and moved on. For him, there was no victory to celebrate. He hadn't gone to Fiona's show to prove anything. He went to be himself, and because of that, something deeper happened. In the city where the studio was located, someone painted a mural. On a brick wall, not far from where Fiona filmed her show, an artist created an image of Keanu Reeves sitting quietly on a bench. Above him, in bold letters, were the words, "Quiet leaders change the world." The mural quickly became a landmark. People stopped to take photos. Some left notes. Others sat on the nearby bench, reflecting quietly. It was more than just a tribute to Keanu. It was a statement, a reminder that not all leaders shout. Some lead in silence. A young woman posted a photo of the mural with the caption, "I used to think power was about who spoke the loudest. Now I know it's about who listens the best." Who's the country, and even around the world, people were talking about that night, about what it meant to stay true to yourself in a world that demanded constant noise. An editor at a major publishing house said it best, "In an era when everyone is shouting to be heard, Keanu Reeves whispered," and we all stopped to listen. Fiona, months after the interview, invited a young author onto her show. She didn't lead with jokes. She asked a simple question: "What do you think the world needs right now?" And when the author began to answer, Fiona didn't interrupt. She listened. During a charity gala later that year, Fiona spoke briefly about the moment that changed her. "I used to think quiet was weakness," she said. "Now I know it takes more strength to stay true to yourself without shouting about it." She paused, scanning the audience. And I have Keanu Reeves to thank for that. In classrooms, studios, homes, and hearts, Keanu's message endured. Not because he fought, but because he stood still. And the world moved toward him. 1 year had passed since the night Keanu Reeves quietly transformed a late-night television stage into something few had ever seen. A place for reflection. A space where the loudness of the world faded away long enough for something honest to be heard. The conversation had changed everything for Fiona Carrington. Her show had evolved. The sarcastic quips were still there from time to time, but they no longer dominated her interviews. Something quieter lived in her now, a different kind of presence, one that asked more questions and gave space for real answers. Her audience had changed too. They came not for spectacle, but for understanding, and night after night, Fiona gave them something she had learned to value: conversation over confrontation, curiosity over judgment, listening over noise. And though she moved forward, one night remained with her. One interview stayed close to her heart. It was late autumn when Fiona attended a charity gala in Los Angeles. She wasn't one for these events anymore. The flashing lights, the shallow conversations, they reminded her of who she used to be, but this time, the cause mattered. The event supported children battling leukemia. She stood near the back of the ballroom, watching the quiet auction unfold. No cameras followed her that night. No producers rushed her from table to table. She was alone, and she liked it that way. As she sipped her sparkling water, her eyes caught a familiar figure near the far exit. Dressed in a simple black suit, his hair just a little longer than the last time she'd seen him. He was talking quietly to one of the hospital directors, his body language gentle and attentive. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't posing for photos. He wasn't surrounded by handlers. He was there, fully present, like always. Fiona watched him for a moment. Then, as if feeling her gaze, Keanu turned toward her. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled in the way celebrities do when they know they're being watched. No forced expressions, just a quiet acknowledgement of something shared. He gave her a small nod. She returned it. And then, as quietly as he had arrived, Keanu excused himself from the conversation and made his way toward the exit. No fanfare, no speeches, just a man choosing to leave when the work was done. Fiona stood there for a long moment, reflecting on what had changed. A few nights later, she found herself sitting at her desk on set. The studio was dark, save for the soft glow of her desk lamp. They were off the air, but she was recording something personal, something she wanted to share without an audience in the room. When the cameras rolled, Fiona spoke directly to the lens. Her tone was quieter now, no script, no rehearsed jokes, just her voice, steady and clear. "It's been 1 year," she said, "since I had a conversation on this show that changed the way I see the world." She paused, her hands resting on the desk in front of her. That conversation wasn't about politics. It wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't about getting the last word. It was about listening and learning. Her eyes softened. Keanu Reeves didn't come here that night to win an argument. He came to remind us of something we all forget, that quiet strength is still strength, that dignity doesn't need to be shouted from rooftops, that sometimes the loudest voice is the one that listens. The camera held on her face. She wasn't performing. She was sharing. "I want to thank Keanu Reeves," she said, "for reminding me and reminding all of us that integrity is the one thing you carry with you when everything else fades." She leaned back slightly in her chair, took a deep breath, and gave a small smile. "This show is different now," she said softly. "I'm different now. And that's because someone chose to sit here and be himself when the world expected something else." She sat quietly for a moment longer, then nodded toward the camera. "Thank you, Keanu." And with that, the segment faded to black. Somewhere far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves rode his motorcycle along the winding roads near the coast. The sky was streaked with the colors of sunset, warm golds and deep reds. The hum of the engine was the only sound on the empty highway. He wore his familiar leather jacket, the same one he'd had for years. No one followed him. No one waited to capture his image. And he liked it that way. The road stretched ahead, quiet, open, full of possibility. Keanu wasn't thinking about the interview that had changed so many people's lives. He wasn't thinking about the articles or the awards Fiona had received for her evolved show. He wasn't thinking about the mural painted on the studio wall that read, "Quiet leaders change the world." He was thinking about his sister, about the promise he made to honor her life, about the quiet choices he made every day that no one saw. And that was enough. As he rounded a bend, the sun dipped lower, the last light of day catching in his rearview mirror. He smiled faintly, unseen, but not unnoticed. His legacy wasn't in the noise he made. It was in the quiet he left behind, a place where others could finally hear themselves think and listen. Keanu Reeves rode on. In a world that often measures leadership by who speaks the loudest or stands in the brightest spotlight, Keanu Reeves quietly showed us something different, something deeper. That true leadership isn't about volume. It's not about winning debates or commanding attention. It's about presence. It's about integrity. And above all, it's about listening. On a stage where sharp words and quick comebacks are usually the weapons of choice, Keanu sat still. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. His quiet strength said everything. And maybe that's the lesson we all needed. Because the world is filled with noise, with people shouting over one another, with arguments and opinions swirling through every space we occupy, on television, online, in our daily lives. But in that noise, we sometimes lose sight of the one thing that matters most: respect. Keanu reminded us that respect doesn't have to be loud. In fact, it's often most powerful when it's quiet, when it's steady, when it's consistent. He reminded us that integrity isn't something you perform for an audience. It's a choice you make day after day when no one's watching. It's about doing the right thing, not because it brings attention, but because it's who you are. And in doing so, Keanu became something rare: a quiet leader. Quiet leaders don't need to dominate the room. They don't need to prove themselves through power plays or clever words. They lead by example, by showing patience, by offering compassion, by standing firm in their values, even when it costs them opportunities, popularity, or praise. In his interview with Fiona Carrington, Keanu never tried to win. He wasn't there for a victory. He was there to be true to himself. And that truth was enough to change the room. It was enough to change Fiona. It was enough to change the conversation. And maybe it's enough to change us. Because there's a lesson in all of this. One that speaks to every single person who has ever felt invisible, who has ever felt unheard, who has ever thought that they had to be louder just to be seen. You don't. Your voice matters, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. True leadership isn't about shouting. It's about listening. It's about respect. It's about staying true to who you are, no matter how loud the world gets around you. And if we all take that to heart, if we all learn to listen a little more, to speak with kindness, to lead with integrity, we might just find that the quietest voices are the ones that leave the greatest impact. So today, we honor the quiet leaders, the ones who show up, not to be seen, but to make a difference, the ones who choose kindness over conflict, the ones who lead by example, not by force. And we thank Keanu Reeves for reminding us of that. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed quiet leadership? Have you ever known someone who led not through words but through actions? Someone whose integrity inspired you, whose kindness changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. Because when we share these stories, we remind each other that quiet strength still exists, that it matters, and that it has the power to change the world. And if you believe that kindness can change the world, if you believe that quiet leadership is still leadership, if you believe that integrity matters, then, like this video, share Keanu's incredible story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who feels invisible. Someone who feels like their voice doesn't matter. Remind them that it does. Quiet leaders change the world, one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of listening at a time. And so can you. Thank you for watching.